Out of any video game series in history, Mario bootlegs are probably the most prominent ones around. This is largely thanks to the dead horse beaten by Siva Gunner and the granddad bootleg of the Flintstones' rescue of Dino and Hoppy. Aside from the odd title screen, it's just Fred Flintstone's sprites with Mario's head. Very little has changed beyond that, and honestly, it's been talked about to death. And let's face it, those bootlegs are pretty boring. Mario's been shoved into a ton of these things like McKids, Tiny Toons, tons of NES games that were about jumping around levels. I want something different, something made from scratch. And that's just what Kart Fighter on the NES is. Kart Fighter is from the Hummer team, an infamous group known for their many pirated games on the NES, in particular, their fighting game engine based on Street Fighter II. Kart Fighter uses that particular engine and pairs up the colorful, friendly characters of Super Mario Kart and has them kicking and punching each other to death. Every character, if you can believe it, has their own moveset, just like Street Fighter II. For a bootleg, the sprite work here is very nice. Well, mostly. And the music has some pretty good songs. A lot of it sounds like electronic farts, but you can at least make out what tracks from Super Mario Kart they're trying to replicate. You'd expect the gameplay here to be trash, but it's not. In fact, it's good. Really good when you consider it's Street Fighter on the NES, a system that was on its way out the door by the time fighting games hit. The various movesets are taken from pre-established Street Fighter mainstays, Mario and Luigi being Ryu and Ken respectively, Peach taking after Chun-Li, and so on. There's a full arcade mode and 2-player versus here to boot, and both function exactly like they should. To be honest, as far as bootlegs go, this is probably one of the best. Making Street Fighter II into something playable on an inferior system in and of itself is impressive, but making it good is almost a miracle. Hummer Team is also responsible for bringing none other than Super Mario World to the NES. On the surface, Mario World seems fairly impressive. The music isn't great, but the sprites at least look faithful to the original game. You're also able to ride Yoshi, and although not one-to-one, there is an overworld map that's fairly reminiscent of the original title. Unlike Kart Fighter though, Super Mario World plays horribly. The controls are frustrating thanks to the wonky physics. Mario will gain and lose momentum on a whim, making what should be easy jumps excessively difficult. The hit detection on the enemies is just as erratic, especially in the early stages against Banzai Bills. The last time we covered bootleg games, we talked about Sonic the Hedgehog on the NES and the subsequent hack that made the game significantly better. Super Mario World also has one such hack, and while it looks better, the gameplay isn't helped along nearly as much. It's worth checking out if you're interested in remakes that hit the NES, but not much more than that. Speaking of Sonic, the biggest point we discussed was Sonic appearing on Nintendo consoles. It should come as no surprise that Mario also appeared on a Sega system, the Genesis. The first Genesis game we have here is none other than Super Mario World, which, hey, didn't we just do this on the NES? Well, no. This time, Super Mario World is entirely different, instead borrowing sprites from Super Mario All-Stars, as well as making some sprites of their own. Most of these are just enlarged versions of pre-existing art, which is likely why they look half-decent. The oddest-looking characters in the game are none other than the Mario Bros themselves, and there's a reason for this. See, gameplay-wise, you'd expect to move left and right and jump around. But there's one huge difference between this and a normal Mario game. Mario can't jump on enemies. Instead, he and Luigi chuck crates at their enemies to deal damage, which sounds stupid, but actually works fairly well. Their other attack is supposed to be a boxing glove, at least that's what the icon and the items you pick up tell me, but it comes out as a fireball. It's actually a nice little option for getting out of situations when you're out of crates, but I prefer to save them up for bosses. The levels are divided into 4 sections, the first 3 of which play the same overworld music you've heard a million times before. It's not great, but given how sound worked on the Genesis, it's at least tolerable, assuming you don't die often. The first few notes are bombastic in the worst way possible and will repeat the second Mario's left the screen, either to continue onward or from dying. The 4th section of each level is a boss, an oversized version of Bowser. Now this is where most players will get tripped up, because Bowser has a teleport move that will throw off most folks and cause them to quit. The animation that plays doesn't seem to fully animate, Hell, it might not even actually exist in the first place. Either way, Bowser seems to be glitching out, at least at first glance. The reality is that he will teleport diagonally, so if you always stay above or below him, take your time, and spend your power shots on him, he's pretty easy. You'd assume the game would keep going with Mario's stages, but after the second, it switches to something entirely different. And that'd be what this game is built on top of: Squirrel King. It should come as no surprise that the same company is behind both of these games: GameTech. Well, sort of. Super Mario World is actually from an ex-GameTech developer, and not much else is known beyond that, other than Squirrel King was released somewhere in 1995, with Mario World following a year later in 1996. By now, you may have noticed that this game plays oddly similar to the old Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers games on the NES, and Squirrel King makes absolutely no effort to hide that fact. Many of the same enemies that appear in Mario World are here in Squirrel King. The gameplay is exactly the same, along with any issues with the camera or gravity. All in all, both Super Mario World and Squirrel King aren't terrible. For bootleg games, they're probably in the higher end in terms of quality. Both games are playable and can be completed, and even feature a 2-player mode. If you want to check out Mario on a console he simply doesn't belong, this would be the one to try. Which is to say, the following titles, spoilers, are not. Since we're still on Super Mario World, it makes sense to just move on to Super Mario World 64. Not much is known about Super Mario World 64's development, or even a release date. Unlike the last game, World 64 attempts to somewhat recreate Super Mario World, similar to the NES iteration. However, there's no overworld to speak of, and the controls are even worse than the NES version. There's not much mid-air control, and the camera is always lagging behind Mario, even when he's walking. This makes timing jumps and avoiding obstacles a pain when they're usually a breeze in the original game. As obvious to anyone with 2 eyeballs, all the art is taken from Super Mario World, and as such, looks pretty good. Backgrounds even animate, which, for bootlegs, is somewhat rare. But the sound effects are all generic stock sounds that are completely mismatched with the game. And if you were expecting an attempt at some FM remixes of Mario World music, well, think again. What's shocking though is that there are mechanics from Mario World that they did manage to replicate properly. Mario has his spin jump and it can break blocks. You're able to climb the cages in the Koopaling's castle, and Mario even animates when he runs. But the basic physics seem to randomly choose when or if it will affect your jumps, and some gimmicks, like the ability to go behind the fence in the castle, are there, but don't function at all. And to top it off, as you might have noticed in the HUD, there's no way to save a power-up. You could attribute the lack of buttons on a normal Genesis controller, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was just forgotten about. Super Mario World 64 is one of those cases where not even the curiosity factor can save it. It's inferior to the NES version from Hummer and doesn't compare to the original. And yet, it's not the worst game we're going to look at today. No, that honor goes to 2 games that are practically one in the same. Mario 3 Around the World and Mario 4 Space Odyssey. Now, every game we've looked at so far has come from the 90s, usually in countries like Taiwan, China, and so on. Mario 3 and 4 come from a company in Russia called BMB, and was published by another country called KDS, or Kudos, in 2011. That's right, not just a bootleg from this century, but this decade, at least when this video is published. BMB churns out games quickly, either by hacking pre-existing ones into supposed new games, or by using their engine, as is the case with these 2 Mario titles. Mario 3 and 4 play identically, with the differences lying more in the story and changes with the level layouts. Graphics are stolen from various Mario games, like Super Mario All-Stars, Mario & Wario, and New Super Mario Bros., but they've also swiped artwork by fans off the internet for their death screens. The music in the game ranges from passable to awful, and like the art, it's all stolen. The tracks come from the various modules and samples from a program called TFM Music Maker by a program who goes by Shiru. Hence why some tracks aren't too bad, but others have you scrambling for the mute button. It's very likely that the worst songs aren't actually bad, just poorly added into the Genesis hardware. Mario is somehow even harder to control than he was in Mario World 64. While in that game, the physics would randomly decide if you had momentum while running and jumping, here, Mario always has the same jump. Mini gaps feel next to impossible to cross, since you'll find an ill-placed block or enemy ready to stop you in mid-air and cause you to plummet to your death. Oddly enough, this game not only has mushrooms, but fire flowers too. The problem is Mario's sprite never changes, so even if you have a fire flower, you'd be forgiven for forgetting to actually use them. Hitboxes on enemies are extremely imprecise. With the weird arc and minimal air control your jumps have, clearing the first stage is a tough challenge. Yet, despite being worse than Super Mario World 64, these games are almost worth trying for the sheer audacity that the developers had. Sure, every game we looked at today stole something from somewhere, but Mario 3 Around the World and Mario 4 Space Odyssey are so blatant, and not to mention recent, that they outright boggle the mind with their existence. And yet, B&B and Kudos aren't just a mere one or two trick pony. Oh no, friends. This pair has a whole catalog of games that take pre-existing titles and place them on a console that they do not belong. So whenever we revisit actual bootleg and pirated games once more, we'll take a long look at the B&B library.